things that I would like to say that won't be exhaustive, and then I'll turn the discussion back over to Bob. We have a small group here at CTNS who, for some years now, has been working on questions related to this. We never got into animals directly, but it was really the question in evolutionary history of how precursors to human behavior might influence what theologians call sin, suffering, and death, and those kinds of things. And we're still putting together a book called Evolving Evil, and some of the faculty and doctoral students in the room have been working on that. And when we looked at sin, we looked at a scholar that some of you may know, René Girard, who has a rather complex understanding of the social nature of sin. And one aspect of it is called mimetic desire. And so I've been asking myself, I'm going to explain what mimetic desire is. Mimesis means to imitate. So a mimetic desire is a desire based upon imitation. And you might say, well, where's Ted going? Well, imagine an object here, and we're going to call this object Cabernet Sauvignon. Okay, and now we've got a subject, and this is Jamie, all right? And you say, Jamie, would you like a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon? He says, nah, I don't want that. He says, I'd rather have a Pepsi. So you've got an object and you've got Jamie. Now, over here, we've got Nate. Now, Nate has a desire for Cabernet Sauvignon. Jamie sees that Nate has a desire for Cabernet Sauvignon, and now he wants that Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's mimetic desire, says Girard, that really is at the base of social conflict. And he has this whole mechanism of how societies are driven into conflict, and then they finally resolve the conflict through sacrifice. So it's a very complex picture of human behavior. Well, I wrote a book on sin some years ago, and I came to the chapter on concupiscence. I don't know if I spell it right. Now, how do they pronounce this word in Great Britain?
You should spell it right first.
Huh?
You should spell it right first.
Yes.
Okay, how did it misspell? C-O-N-C-U-P-I-S-C-E-N-C-E? At any rate, I usually hear people from England pronounce it concupiscence. But how do you pronounce it?
I don't use the word very often.
Okay, here's my story. I had to illustrate it. Is that I had a cat one time whose name was Socrates, and my son brought this cat home at, it was probably only 4 weeks old at the time, and he had worked at the gas station, and a dog had come and killed the cat's mother while she had this litter of kittens out behind the gas station. So he gave away most of the kittens and brought Socrates the black cat home. And I was writing a book at the time, and so baby Socrates grew up on my desk under the lamp. It was kind of nice and warm there. And I had a cousin named Jim who was a veterinarian. And he said, and I'd like to hear Mark's opinion on this, he said that if you feed an animal from birth on cheap, dried pet food, it will never want the expensive kind of pet food. So I thought, well, I'm going to try an empirical experiment. So I raised Socrates on, but it was nutritious dried cat food. And Socrates was very happy growing up on my desk. Well, somewhere around 12 weeks old, Socrates, who had only known dried pet food, had an adventure. There was another cat, an outdoor cat, that had come into the house. And my wife was walking around in the kitchen, and the outdoor cat started meowing real loudly. Well, Socrates is sitting in the corner watching the outdoor cat, and Socrates began to meow the same way the outdoor cat did. And then my wife walked over to the refrigerator, and the outdoor cat started walking around in circles meowing. And Socrates started walking around in circles meowing. My wife reached into the refrigerator, and now the outdoor cat is on his hind legs with a fever-pitched meow. Socrates gets on his hind legs. My wife pulls out a piece of bologna, holds it above the outdoor cat, who now is swiping at it like this and screaming. She drops the bologna, and Socrates races over, grabs the bologna before the outdoor cat does, and from then on was a carnivore. And it strikes me, yep, mimetic desire, not just a human phenomenon, but an animal phenomenon too. Have you seen anything like that? Yeah. Okay. That's all I had to say. Bob's in charge.
They don't call me a moderator, I'm not moderator. So we may not take the full hour. This is a chance to Celia, hear any more comments you all want to make, and then give her a chance to respond to everything she's heard. We'll see how it goes, and right by here. So, comments on today from the beginning. Anything else that you want to add to what we've said already? Yeah, great.
I'd like to hear Dr. Dean Drummond talk more about the distinction between ethics and morality, because I thought I heard that there was a comparison between different ethical systems and how some of them might be simpler than others, and that could be a distinction between ethics and morality.
I mean, nobody's responding.
Oh, was you go?
I didn't quite get the question, so I have difficulty responding. But you repeated.
Relation of ethics and morality.
What kind?
Relation of ethics to morality.
Ethics to morality.
Yeah, that's the relation.
Well, as a non-theologian, non-scientist, a human being, a lover of animals, educating of them, I feel what I do is more important than what I say. I've got a lot of words today. Some of them I'm still digesting because they're theological. And that's the only part of this that escapes me a little bit.
Okay, good. Maybe we can clarify. Chris?
I was wondering if Professor DeJong could maybe ferret out a little bit more what she means by redemption and atonement through the wisdom Christology model. I don't think I dozed off at that point, but I'm having a problem understanding exactly what would be atoned for or what would be redeemed through this wisdom model. So maybe if you could give me a smaller version of that, that'd be great.
Thanks, Chris. Folks haven't had a chance to speak today yet? Yeah.
I was very intrigued with the first poll. I appreciate greatly all that you did in your paper, all the respondents. I was intrigued by your use of Sergei Bulgakov and Eastern Orthodox thought. You said that his thought is not mainstream Orthodox. Did I hear you saying that? And could you just say a little bit about in what way his thought goes off the path of mainstream Orthodoxy on some of the points that we've made in the paper?
If I trust my notes, was the notion of inevitability versus the necessity of something like sin or evil behavior come up. Anyway, I made notes. And if that's something that Professor D. Drummond could speak to, just to speak a little bit more about the difference between the inevitability and the necessity, and why sin may perhaps be inevitable but not necessary, or something different.
Let me take that one, start. Yeah, I did somewhat quite a bit about my paper. I'm trying to capture the logic of Augustine's definition of sin. The reason why I'm trying to retrieve his definition as best I can without depending upon his historical narrative of the fall. Right? And so the underlying logic, according to Reinhold Niebuhr in his different lectures, is that what Augustine wants to do is avoid the Manichaean problem of making sin necessary because it's part of our nature, because that then attributes to God. And yet not make it so unnecessary that we can avoid it by, courageous acts. That would be Pelagian. The sort of modern self-help movement is a kind of Pelagian tendency to sin. Okay. So his argument was that it's neither Manichaean nor Pelagian, and Augustine could deliver on that because he had an historic event. Being historical wasn't natural, it was an act of will. But it's still an event which is transmitted into everyone, and in essence is inevitable. So it's unnecessary that it's not in our nature, but as created, but it's inevitable, we inherit it, we can't avoid it. And that allowed him to talk about sin in this quite a way. And my point is that with Niebuhr, you can appropriate the unnecessary but inevitable logic of what constitutes sin, or in essence constitutes sin, without having to have a fallen narrative. But if you do that, I think you tip the scales back towards the Manichaean side, because you can then you say, well, how did it come about? And you see sort of precursors or preliminary aspects of it in the underlying physics and biology that constitutes our acts in our single acts of violence, hatred, and which configure the world since the beginning. So in a certain sense, Niebuhr's Niebuhr's retrieval of the logic of sin doesn't help us fully avoid a kind of Manichaean view of the world. And that's part of my argument that if you take that view, then you have what I call a cosmic fallacy. You have an unsolvable problem. And I use that actually to drive Christian theologians away from an origins account of sin to a redemptive account of sin. That what's really counts is how God responds to sin, not why it's there, why God allows it. Couldn't God have stopped it? But in fact, to look at the cross as the first instance of God finally overcoming brokenness and sin in the world. So I use the Augustine account through Niebuhr to actually make the case that it actually isn't retrievable, but not because of the fall, but because it's Manichaean.
Right, I understand that. What I was really looking for, though, was an argument from evolutionary theory or evolutionary understanding for either the necessity or the unnecessity, or the inevitability or the inevitability of sin.
Right, and Schleiermacher gets it to us even before Darwin, and then you get it almost like every person in theology and science. So they're all going to give you an account of the evolutionary aspect of sin. But most of them are relying on Schleiermacher and Irenaeus and on Augustine. So that was why this unnecessary inevitable is actually the code for a different stream of thought that you can also do in that version. But now, let's ask you to take it from there. So we have 3 or 4 good questions. Yeah.
I wanted to, I realize that the focus today has been on theodicy and the shadow of Sophia in evolution, but because of that focus, and as a biologist looking at evolution and seeing it as this, this incredible creative process that has a lot, has so much creaturely Sophia in it that's truly beautiful, and I just kind of want to ask maybe for a response in terms of that larger picture of an evolutionary nature, so that instead of going away with this sense of evolution being so shadowed and so dark, that there is within the scientific story a lot of, for instance, the dialectic between continuity and individuality between species is really richly addressed in what I do, going into genomes and comparisons of genomes between species. And that also natural selection gets demonized so much instead of being seen as a way to optimize the relationality that we've also talked about. So, just, you know, in the widening and sort of taking today, I see today, taking and really focusing on the difficult aspects of it, but wanting maybe a few comments on widening that back out to a recognition of evolution in its truly creative immensity that's just mind-boggling.
That's another good question for say. My quick gloss on it is that in the theology and science field, right, there's been such an emphasis to recapture evolution from the atheists and the ID folk. It's been done by saying that's how God creates life. It's a celebration of life, a diversity, of cooperation, of fecundity.
This is very
right?
nice there.
And that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But what Cindy is saying to us, it's been a minor voice, a less heard voice. It's also this shallow side, this tragic side. And most of the people in theology and science will say, well, that's just natural. You couldn't have evolution without it. So there's evolution is good or zero. It's not also somehow tragic and to be redeemed. And that's what I appreciate about what she's doing. She's saying, well, to the extent that it's creation, it's great. To the extent that it's suffering, disease, death, and extinction, is to be redeemed. And then both are affirmed. So, well, I think you have nothing to play. Why don't you come in here?
Yeah, why don't you come?
You want to sit
Can
or?
I'll stand up,
Okay, good.
because then I can project my voice into you. It's been quite a long day, and I've noticed that a lot of people have left, so I don't blame them at all. So I think if I was here, I'd do the same. But what I thought I would do is respond to the questions that have just been raised, and then I will also respond to some of the more formal responses, and then see whether there are any other questions in light of that. And I don't want to keep us here longer than we need to, because I'm sure some of the things that people want to raise can be done one-to-one, because there aren't so many of you left, as it were. The first question has to do with the ethics and morality distinction. Now, this is an area that's problematic in that many different philosophers have used these terms in so many different ways. It's rather like the term nature. Should we stop using it altogether because there are so many different interpretations and definitions? I would say we can't necessarily avoid using it. But just to give you a contrast, Stephen Clark, who's a philosopher who spent many years thinking about animals and animal issues, says that ethics is where animals can have an ethic, but they can't be moral. Now, I found that quite interesting when I read that, because as far as I'm concerned, I was more inclined instinctively to think the other way around. But it partly depends on what you mean by those particular terms. And what he meant was morality was more about a sophisticated form of agreement that was written down by communities in such a way that it forms codes of practices. Now, if you see moral in that sense, then of course animals cannot have it, and it may be one of the reasons why we've had James Hay, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, objecting to the idea of morality in animals, because he would then, if that's the case, also agree with Stephen Clark. But on the other hand, he says that animals can have ethics. Now, what on earth could he mean by that? If you see ethics as being connected with our emotions in some way, in other words, being connected with virtues, then of course animals can have ethics. And the way that Mark Beckhoff helpfully describes morality could also be a description of virtue ethics. So the two are quite fuzzy, really, and I think that as long as we know what we're trying to say and what we're saying, then we're not going to get too confused, but very easy to get confused. So I actually have decided to use the word moral world rather than ethics, because ethics too often has this connotation of some separate philosophical detached view of how we think about things and rules of conduct and things, which are so alien to animal behaviours to be not particularly helpful. So on that basis, I would say, yes, we could use those terms. It probably, I could have spent 10 minutes trying to define what I meant. I didn't do that because I would rather build up a picture by by example, as it were, so it becomes clear by what I'm saying, what I'm trying to mean by morality and so on. Maybe we need to look at that again. The second one has to do with what's wisdom doing in relation to redemption and atonement. I think one of the things I've noticed when I've been thinking about eco-theology in particular, and also some of those authors in the science and religion discussion that have looked at theodicy, is that the language of redemption is brought in, the language of the future is brought in relation to the new world, without actually going through the lens of how is this dealt with on the cross. And that to me is bypassing the atonement, thinking about redemption. Atonement, for me, means what Christ has done on the cross in order to make us one with God, at one meant. Now there are two facets to that. One is in relation to our deliberate acts of evil, as it were, and the other is in relation to suffering. The one that's the most interesting as far as we're concerned in this particular conference is in terms of moral responsibility in non-human creatures, and whether they need some sort of reconciliation in the light of what we might see as deliberate choices on their part. Now I know this is controversial and this is something we can discuss or think about further, but that's why I want to, further reason why I want to bring a discussion of atonement into this, as well as redemption, because it's easy to talk about the future, a new life of creatures or a new life in humans and so on. But that's more, as I see it, eschatology, that is an understanding of the future, rather than actual atonement in relation to redemption. Where does wisdom fit into all of that? Well, I've tried in some of the other writing I've done to talk about the wisdom of the cross, but and that is a sort of more in-depth reflection of what Paul means when he talks about the wisdom of the cross in 1 Corinthians. The wisdom of the cross there is an overturning of our preconceptions about power, and if you like, what seems foolishness to us turns out to be the means through which God redeems the world. And that is, if you like, his understanding of the wisdom of the cross. In addition, the wisdom of the cross speaks against philosophical rhetoric that bears no resemblance to being connected with what is actually happening on the ground, as it were. And that's what Paul was arguing against in 1 Corinthians. He was arguing against those who use sophisticated rhetoric in order to try and make their case. Whereas he said that instead of all that, the wisdom that we have isn't the wisdom of rhetoric, but it's the wisdom of the cross. In other words, the wisdom of a self-emptying, humiliated Christ standing there in front of us, as it were, as a suffering servant, rather than as someone who's been trying to be clever through sophisticated philosophical language. And I think that is, if you like, the first lesson of the wisdom of the cross, is that it needs to be grounded in reality of what really is the case, the tragic reality of what is the case. Our theodicy, our attempts at theodicy will never really fully tackle the problem of evil, and I think we need to remind ourselves of that. In addition, the wisdom of the cross, as I've interpreted, also includes this understanding of shadow Sophia. Now, this isn't something that Sergei Bulgakov did particularly, unless I've missed something in his writing. But what I wanted to say was somehow at the cross, shadow Sophia is transformed. Now, I may need to think a little bit harder about whether shadow Sophia is disappears or whether it's but I think I probably prefer the language of transformation rather than removal, to imply that the whole of the reality as we see it is taken up into the divine movement of death and resurrection. When it comes to Sergei Bulgakov, one question was he wasn't considered mainstream. Well, he was criticised because he thought of divine wisdom as being in the ousia of God. Ousia means being. Now, it's quite natural for Protestant and Catholic theologians to talk about God as being love. And we don't seem to have any problems with that. God's being is love, and love is in the Trinity, and so on. But Orthodox theologians are much more reluctant to even name the ousia, or the being of God. They prefer to talk about God's energies, or energia. And energies are the wisdom, power, and other aspects of God that we see reflected in the world. So Bulgakov was not mainstream by naming wisdom as the ousia of God. Now, I think that it's quite helpful to see God in this way, not just as love, but also wisdom, simply because it allows us to see how that can fall out in relation to the created world as well. And in a book that I wrote in 2000, I talked about creation being in love, but through wisdom. In other words, there's wisdom reflected in the whole of the created order. And this brings in something another question that came in later about what about the celebration that we should find in the evolutionary process. Well, I think we can do this by thinking about creaturely Sophia. Creaturely Sophia in relationship to divine Sophia. The two are at play with each other, as it were. And we can draw on Proverbs 8 and talk about wisdom, which is what Proverbs 8 talks about. Ever at play with God, ever at play from the beginning of creation. So there's a sense of continuity, but also individuality in that sense of play. And in addition to that, it leads to an understanding of existence that's both free in itself, but also reflects the beauty and the love and wonder of God. The next question is about the language of inevitability and necessity and things. And I think here we come into some logical conundrums which are quite hard to resolve. What I was trying to put my finger on really was how the language of necessity, where it's used, implies an inevitability to forms of suffering and evil that seems to almost accept them as being part of the fabric of the natural world, as if they could never ever be changed, or as if that they are there, as it were, on the way to something good in the next life, in a way that somehow softens their horrible impact. So I would want to say, well, our theodicy needs to be a response to sin or a response to evil, rather than just simply coming to terms with it. And I think that Bob Russell has very helpfully expanded some of that by looking in more detail at some of Augustine's theories and so on. I think that probably answers, unless I've missed something, the questions that have come from the floor just now. What I thought I would do next was just very briefly run through some of the responses that have been offered to my paper this morning. As a full day, I'm immensely grateful for the time and the trouble that all the respondents have taken to actually read my work carefully and take it seriously enough to respond in such a detailed way. And I feel very grateful for your help in this, and I'm sure that it will all help me revise what I hope to say in my paper in a way that makes it clearer and perhaps takes into account some of the things I haven't thought of. So that's my first word, is one of appreciation to everybody really for their contributions. And of course Mark Beckhoff's videos as well. They, I think, actually illustrated in a way that goes beyond words how we can be surprised by the behaviour of the relationships between animals of different species. And I can still see that image of the snake and the hamster in my mind's eye. and also the image of those dogs playing. And I think that those kind of images stick with you in our memories in a way that actually is very formative, just as it's very formative sometimes to have experiences of other creatures which then help us understand a little bit more about what it is like to be non-human. And should we, I think he's right to say, we shouldn't be too embarrassed about our anthropomorphizing. Although I would say that that maybe we need a different word for reading into animal behaviour in ways which are problematic, as I think they did in some of the medieval histories, where they put dogs on trial and put, blamed pigs for certain acts of violence and so on. And so I feel that the most helpful way to anthropomorphise is one where we're in tune with what the animals are doing themselves through our own careful paying attention to that particular behaviour. And it's that ability to pay attention which I think connects the life of the ethologist with the life of the theologian. Because it's through paying attention that we encounter wonder, if you like, wonder in the natural world, but also wonder in relation to who God is. And I think that is why the experience of doing biology opens us up to the transcendent in a way which I think brings together both theology and the sciences. I haven't had the opportunity to talk about wonder in this talk, but I just wanted to say that I was really excited about the possibility of wonder in chimpanzees and what that might mean. And I would want to sort of wait for research really before I go as far as saying that this is proto-religious, which is what Oliver Putt suggested. I think his term proto-religious has as many problems as the idea of latency or quasi-morality, which he criticised me for. So I'm not quite sure on that basis whether we're just introducing another problem. However, I didn't mean by latency anything that was condescending. In other words, it wasn't meant to be condescending to animals, because I think the prime example I wanted to highlight here was their morality within their own worlds, and I don't like the idea of using a different term because that leads to too much separation. The only purpose of latency was to try and show that we have a history, if you like, that we have an evolved history, a history where some of the behaviours that we find, moral behaviours, behaviours grounded in our emotions and so on, that are the basis of certain forms of the way we think of morality, also have their counterparts in the history of evolution. So it's not intended to be condescending or say that we are superior in that way, but to say there is a continuity, a history there. And we won't really know what that latency is, perhaps, until we look at early hominids and how can we possibly understand how early hominids really behaved. I know that some of the work of scholars have looked into the paleontology of anthropology and so on, anthropological paleontology. I haven't gone into that. Stephen Miffin is a very good example of a researcher in the UK, he's at Reading University. He's done a book on the prehistory of the mind. Now, his work I think is fascinating. I haven't gone into any of that, but I do. That's the sense in which I mean latency. So I'm not necessarily saying that what we see in the animal world today is latency, because that probably would be a mistake, but saying that perhaps in the prehistory of the mind, in our earliest hominid ancestors, and before that to unknown common ancestors to human and animals, there we maybe find these tendencies. So that's what I was intending, so it's not supposed to be condescending. The idea of an anthropogenic evil, which is distinct from moral evil and natural evil, the distinction is a blurred one. It's not intended to suggest that there's a category that's totally separate, but it's really a way of trying to reinforce the point that we are probably the most destructive animals on Earth. In fact, we are the most destructive animals on Earth. If we think of any sort of immorality in lions, or some of the lions that have since started attacking elephants, young elephants, they've learned to like elephants, even though they don't need always young elephants in terms of their own need for survival. And this is something that's been reported recently in Africa. They've gone out and attacked elephants seemingly just for the fun of it. Now, I think we can read into that negative thoughts, but it's nothing compared to our own destructive abilities towards the non-human creation. And the reason why I suggest that it's somewhere at the boundary between moral and natural evil is because there's an aspect of that anthropogenic evil that's deliberate. You know, we go out and consume and waste things, even though we know deep down it's going to cause environmental problems. That's one aspect, but sometimes it may be unintentional. We don't maybe realise that when we're switching on lights, or we haven't done in the past, maybe we haven't really realised the full impact that this might have. But just because it's unintentional doesn't mean to say it's not evil, and Aquinas was able to distinguish between intentional and non-intentional acts. And I think that he said, you know, that maybe others will help me on this as well, but while one may be worse in terms of being morally culpable, it doesn't mean to say that one of them is right because it's unintentional. And when it came to James Haig's talk, obviously there is a different mindset here about what animals are capable of or not. And I'm grateful that we did have an alternative view presented so that people could make their own minds up as to whether they follow in this stream or not. But at the same time, I think the idea of moral freedom needs to go beyond, in animals, needs to go beyond simply seeing it as just being instinctive behaviour. In other words, where there is a sense of choice, then I think we can't just say it's kind of happening kind of automatically. And I would be less worried about anthropomorphisms that he feels are inappropriate. In other words, he would say that it's a category mistake to talk about morality in animals. And it's one that's been a tradition in philosophy for some time. So he follows in a tradition of philosophy that's historically suggested that, which is why, of course, that this turn, as it were, is new. And I think people need to decide for themselves, do we turn to this new way of thinking about animals and with its impact on our understanding of morality or not? Much as the same way as in the past, we have to ask ourselves, do we think of animals as being rational or not? And so we have a choice whether we say it's a category mistake. There were plenty of people in the past that said, oh, well, animals are not intelligent. And they cannot possibly have languages as humans have languages. But this bright line between humans and non-humans, I would say, is open for question. We need to try and interpret animal behaviour in its own terms. And we mustn't think of animals as automatons. And the idea of pro-social as well, which he uses, I think does sound condescending.